Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. Friends and familiars, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a writer that is one of the OGs of the splatterpunk genre. He balances compelling storylines with the finesse of brutality. He's joining me today to discuss his recent novel entitled Old Scratch. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Kristopher Rufty. Kristopher, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 29th day of April 2024. I came across your work when I stumbled into Aaron Beauregard's live stream one night. Being relatively new to the world of extreme horror, I discovered that you are one of the originals, so I checked out your novel entitled Old Scratch and found it to be a surreal, immersive tale about a road trip from hell featuring evil rednecks, betrayal, and a mother's grief. So I really enjoyed it and am looking forward to doing a deep dive into this work, as well as your previous and upcoming work.
Great. Thank you.
So, the book is about a young woman named Marcy Corbin who lost a baby to SIDS and is desperate to bring her back to life. So desperate that she's willing to make a deal with the devil, or maybe something like the devil, so to speak. So she sets out on a road trip with her dead child and a group of people that she never agreed to have ride along. So right off the bat, we have the road trip, which is ripe for horror, reminiscent of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and House of a Thousand Corpses. So we know that the road trip translates amazingly well to film. What would you say are the elements of the road trip that can be best used for literary horror, and which ones did you try to employ most effectively in your story?
Well, I love the road trip horror story, especially if you're in an area that you're not familiar with. Everything is new and unreal. There are strangers all around. You don't know what's safe, what's not safe. I think that translates very well into a horror story just because it adds to a certain level of dread even before the actual horror takes place and gets started. And I've tried to use that a lot in Old Scratch because movies like The Hitcher and even like early 2000s movies like The Forsaken, do that very well, where you're just out in the middle of nowhere and stumble upon things along the way that you wouldn't ever think might even exist in the world until you're out there on that desolate road.
Mm-hmm. And do you think one is scarier than the other, or they have kind of their equal merits? The setting of a rural area versus maybe something more urban or suburban, like in Jordan Peele's movie. What was it called? Get Out, I think?
Oh, yeah. I guess it's two sides of the coin, really. They both offer the same thing, but in different packages, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Because the desolation of, being out in the middle of nowhere, the rural areas and everything like that, you can't see what's coming. But in the more suburban areas, you can see what's coming, but you still don't know what it is. And I like both aspects of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess urban as well. Like, I guess probably the juxtaposition of what is supposed to be nice, welcoming, and a pleasant surrounding, going through a suburb, nicely cultivated lawns, people waving to each other, and then all of a sudden there's like this creepy underbelly, and then you go straight into like an urban area where it's like a downtown scene, maybe somewhat dystopian. I guess all those different scenarios have their own merit, but there is something about going on a road trip and just getting further and further away from civilization, because at least in the urban and suburban settings, you might still be close to help. You know what I mean?
True. And in the rural areas, when you get further and further away from the safe place, which is home,
yeah,
home can end up being days away, and you're out in the middle of nowhere with everything going wrong all around you. That's terrifying to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, you added a very strange element to the story in that Marcy pretended that the child had never died. She continued to have baby supplies delivered to her house and stayed out of the public view so no one noticed the baby's absence. In order to keep the baby fresh, so to speak, she bribes the neighborhood funeral director to keep the child refrigerated so her body won't decompose. She then transports the baby in a cooler to which she is constantly adding ice. This way, when she reaches her destination, she has an intact child to reanimate. So this was simultaneously heartfelt and disturbing. What feelings were you attempting to evoke in the reader with this aspect of the story, and what have your readers reported via reviews and or messages?
I don't know if I was like purposely trying to evoke feelings, but I definitely wanted her desperation and her determination and devotion to the child to come across. So even though the baby's no longer, with her, she's still doing her motherly duties that she feels that she has to do because she cares about that child. So it's sort of a nurturing aspect, even after the fact of what happened to the baby. So she's still taking care of the baby along the way, just like, you would with a child on a road trip. You have to stop, change the baby, feed the baby. She had to stop, make sure the ice wasn't melting, make sure everything was still just right the way it needed to be.
Mm-hmm.
So she was still being a good mom was what she was doing. And readers have really seemed to identify with her a lot, which I was worried about when I wrote it because, I'm a guy and I'm writing from the first person point of view of a young mother.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a tricky situation. You don't want to be stereotypical, but you want to be honest, and make it realistic, but at the same time, it's still a horror story. So, But yeah, everyone seems to really identify with her. So I think I did something right with her. And this story is absolutely one of my favorites as well. So I've been very happy with the response that it's gotten, and especially with Marcy, and as the story progresses and the turns that she takes and everything along the way. So people really seem to like it.
Nice. Yeah, and I guess, I don't know, I think it's probably possible that people that haven't read your book may not know what SIDS is. SIDS, the acronym for Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, and it's kind of broadly stated as inexplicable death, although they do have some causes they level towards it, like I think they call it rebreathing asphyxia. They tell you ABC, alone on their back in a crib, on their back so they don't smother themselves by rebreathing their own carbon dioxide, and alone because some people do sleep with their baby and inadvertently roll over on top of them and smother them to death. But that is not what happened in this book. You will have to read the book to find out. But yeah, I thought maybe I should illuminate people if that's not common knowledge.
Yeah, and that's terrifying as well. I mean, just the whole fact that SIDS is a thing. You know, I have 3 kids, so as a parent, when they were babies, it was like constantly checking on them, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your kid misses one breath, the maternal paternal instinct kicks in, and you sit up in bed and like, what the hell was that?
Mm-hmm. They cough in their sleep, and it's just like you jump out of bed and just stare at them for a while.
Call 911. Yeah. Well, Marcy's intention is for her and her husband Travis to make the trip themselves, but once she retrieves her child, she finds what was at one time her best friend Ian and Ian's sister seated in her car. Travis, for some reason, had told Ian what they were doing, and Ian decided he wanted to go along. And despite Marcy's strong objections, Ian basically blackmails Marcy into letting he and his sister ride along. So this adds a severe level of uncertainty and lack of control to the situation that Marcy is not happy about. And Ian used to be Marcy's best friend, but was also Travis's employer, so to speak, if you could refer to that trade as an employer-employee relationship.
Basically.
What was the significance of Ian's different relationships with Marcy and Travis for the narrative?
What was funny was when Ian first popped up, he was kind of more one-dimensional, but then as the story went along, he started to really expand. So before, when I first put him in there, he was more or less going to be sort of the villain of the story. And then as the story went along, as you could read that, as you've read that, he's really not. So it's like when he started to flesh himself out in the story, he basically ended up being a part of both of them. So he came from Marcy's past. So he came up with Marcy, saw everything that Marcy had gone through since they were kids, and they grew up together. But then he also broke apart from Marcy, and he met Travis. So he's seen Travis and where Travis has come from. And in some weird way, he's like the anchor that's kind of holding them two together in that car. Because if it was just probably Travis and Marcy by themselves, I don't know how far they would have made in that trip without, arguing, or Travis just saying, enough of this, we're not doing this.
Yeah.
Ian was definitely kind of the anchor, the captain of the ship, and all of the above, really.
Yeah. Ian in general was probably the most complex character in the story. He could be threatening, loving, violent, and reckless. And it seemed like he adopted these traits when the situation called for it, because he was, as crazy as it seemed like he was usually the voice of reason, like you were kind of alluding to. He was also the problem solver and the hero in most of the situations in which they found themselves. So based on the entirety of the story, including the end, which I won't spoil, would you consider him an anti-hero?
Most likely, yeah, I guess in a way, because like I was saying earlier, he started off as the villain in my head, but as the story went along, I was like, no, this guy isn't the villain. It's almost like it's not just Marcy's story, it's Ian's story as well. So it's weird how he ended up becoming such a huge factor in that story.
Yeah. Well, they are driving to what they believe is a mythical town called Bannon by following directions from a map that Marcy's grandmother drew, which purportedly leads to the area where they could find Old Scratch. Marcy was taking an awful lot of risk when it came to breaking the law. She was also driving many hours to a place that existed only on a map her grandmother, who had gone senile, had drawn. What made her so willing to believe the fantastical stories that her grandmother told? And I might be unclear about it, but I feel like I remember from the book that the town didn't exist officially. Like the people that made it there had to base it on things they found on the internet, or like in Marcy's case, something her grandmother drew up.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Bannon's sort of like a little sub-town in a larger town.
Okay.
But yeah, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, no, it technically doesn't exist on the books, on the record, but it does exist.
Okay. Well, what made her so willing to believe the fantastical stories her mother told and to go to so much risk? Because I understand the desperation of wanting your child to survive, but I don't know. It seems like at some point rational restraint would take over, but I don't know what was going on in her head.
Well, she'd heard so many of the stories herself that she had been researching it, in the book. So she knew what she had found herself and what she had discovered herself and learned herself. But then without giving anything away, when her grandmother's laying everything out for her, she pretty much tells her exactly why Old Scratch is so prominent in their family, and she knows in her mind and in her heart that 100% it's true. But convincing everyone else, that was the harder part, except for Ian. He was around it himself. So he sort of knew that everything was on the level, I guess.
Gotcha. Well, one of the main ways that Marcy was initiated in the mystery behind Old Scratch was by looking up books on the dark arts in the library. She had to keep it a secret from her mother, though, who would have been outraged if she found out. And I also loved going to the library as a kid, and I can relate to doing the same thing myself because my mom, I was about to say was very religious, but she is still very religious. My go-tos were books on the occult, martial arts, and true crime. What were yours, and what would you say makes a library more magical than a retail bookstore?
Gosh, I don't know. Just something about the library, And you're absolutely right. It is more magical than just a retail bookstore, which don't get me wrong, I love bookstores.
Yeah.
I could spend hours and hours in a bookstore. But something about the library, I guess because in the library, there's also maybe some history involved. There's local history. The library here has been featured in many of my books, but it's more of a fictitious take on it.
Mm-hmm.
But, as a separate floor where it's just nothing but local history stuff. So you can go in there and research it, and it's really cool. But yeah, it's just something about just being in the library and researching stuff. To me, that beats going online, at home and researching things. And my daughter's the same way. She likes to do all her research for stuff at the library. And, growing up as a kid, I guess the stuff, and even as I became older, that I would look into was a lot of folklore, especially local folklore, because I always kind of like to know what the old legends of, where I grew up were. And I found all kinds of crazy stuff, like local Bigfoot type stuff, which is great. Giant insects, giant leeches, and all kinds of stories that's just, all around where I live. And also, like with you, I did the true crime stuff, occult stuff. And it was always just more of just kind of like a curiosity. And you could just go there, grab the book, and give them your library card. And I would be, 11 years old with a book on satanic panic, and they just check it out and say it's due in 2 weeks. There was no questions asked or anything. And something about that is just, just amazing to me. So I don't know. I guess libraries, just because I was around it so much, growing up and still am, it's just always, to me, something very magical and very prominent,
Yeah, it is kind of weird. You're trying to find, I guess, like you said, the satanic panic or something like really out there on the fringe. And you walk up to this very reserved, matronly librarian and you're like, you feel kind of weird about asking about it. And it doesn't matter what you ask them. They listen intently and say, yes, it's going to be over here.
Yeah. They'll even take you and show you where it is.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, people do it all the time in like a Barnes and Noble, and I'm sure other bookstores just grab something off the shelf and sit down somewhere and read it. And I think they tolerate that to an extent, but they probably get sick of it after a while. But, libraries usually have like a lounge area. And I think, at least for me, a lot of it is the fact that those books have traveled. The knowledge has been consumed by so many different people. And, when they don't have a book and they order it for you, there's no telling where it comes from. These books are traveling back and forth all over the place. I don't know. For me, it seems like the books are almost visiting celebrities.
Right. Yeah. They all have their own history, yeah, their own story to tell.
Yeah.
And I used to love, like the old library books, that the back of the book, they had the card in there with the person's name on it and the date when they checked it out and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was like a passport.
Yeah, I loved that because you could see who all had it and everything. I mean, I know there was probably privacy issues with that, but
yeah,
still, it was neat because sometimes I'd, be looking at a book and I go, oh, I know him.
Yeah, and even though they weren't supposed to, sometimes people would write in the margins, and it'd be interesting to see what they found interesting or what they wrote about it. Like, if read a true crime book that's got some certain parts underlined, you're like, oh God, who the hell is this? Well, the legend of Old Scratch has very rich folklore behind it, speaking of history. And I know that Old Scratch, I believe anyway, is a common term for the devil, but was the entity in your story based on anything from history? And if so, what? Because it wasn't exactly the devil per se.
Yeah, he was sort of, I guess, like a Cuisinart of different things, just reading a lot about old folklore and stuff. He's naturally, of course, based on the Devil of the Crossroads story with the blues musician, who goes and sells his soul. So there's a lot of that history in there. There's also there's supposed to be like two places in the world that the devil returns to on one night of the year. And I read all the lore about that and everything, which that's been proven to be completely untrue and more fabricated by the town to try to keep people out of the town. But it worked in reverse and people just kept coming to the town. So now they don't even acknowledge that anymore. So yeah, I took like little bits and pieces of influences from all these different stories about people who had meetings with quote unquote the devil and made deals. And kind of like I was saying earlier, it really just stems from the old classic story of somebody going and making a deal with the devil, and I sort of took that and just went crazy with it and somehow tried to make it even darker than it could possibly be beforehand, because that story with the blues musician has always intrigued me. I remember my dad told me that story originally when I was a kid, because my dad listened to a lot of different types of music, and, bluegrass and blues music was, something he would listen to out in his garage when he'd be working on cars and stuff. And I just remember one summer night him telling me about that story. He's like, some of these musicians are so good because there's legend that said they sold their soul to the devil to be able to play that good. And that just stuck with me, So
yeah, maybe for some of them the devil was heroin.
Yeah.
Yeah, the goddamn Streisand effect. The more you try to keep people out, the more they want to come in. Well, one element of their story is their encounter with some deviant rednecks that are reminiscent of the movie Deliverance. Besides the fact that they exist in an isolated area, what would you say makes the proverbial evil redneck so scary?
I guess because, what's funny is, the rednecks that end up in my stories are usually just based on people I see around where I live, because I live out in the South. So it's like, I kind of know, I get why sometimes people can be terrified of certain classifications like that. But I think, like, as far as a horror story goes, what makes them so scary and really gives them a very strong foothold in a story is they make their own rules. And they're completely different usually than the characters they're interacting with. So it's like two different types of people, and they are basically crashing together, and you have one type crashing into this other type that just does whatever they want to do. And usually, like in an area where there's not a lot of eyes around, they kind of, can get away with it too. So that makes them also scary.
Yeah, it seems like if they grow up in a rural area where they're not surrounded by the pressure of civilized society to conduct themselves in a particular way, they get used to thinking that doing things that are illegal is okay. It's kind of commonplace.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you mind me asking where you live?
I live in North Carolina.
North Carolina. Okay. Yeah, I'm down here in Texas.
Oh, wow.
So deep south.
So you get it then.
Well, let's see here. Circling back to the book, an ever-present danger in the story was Marcy's daughter Vivian's body thawing out in the cooler, so she was always getting more ice to add to the cooler to keep her body preserved. And you pretty much already addressed this. You know, it was almost like if a woman would breastfeed a live child and nourish it, she was nourishing her dead child by keeping it on ice.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember what exactly you said when you addressed it earlier, but was that an intended metaphor? And if not, what were those moments meant to add to the story?
Yeah, I guess it could be a metaphor, but it was definitely there to show her devotion to her child, even though the child's no longer with her. Marcy was a good mom. And, you know, she blames herself for the infant's death and everything, but she worked hard as a mom. And even on that road trip, you know, trying to keep everyone at, you know, peaceful with each other and going against everything they went up against, she still made sure that baby was taken care of. So, yeah, it was more of a display of the type of person Marcy was. Even though she's definitely taken a dark turn to go on that trip to begin with, you know, she's still at her core a wonderful mother who cares about her child.
Mm. Well, throughout the story, we are aware of Marcy's motive for trying to find Old Scratch, but the others have their own reasons, which I obviously won't spoil. Not knowing your writing process, do these connections unfold as you write, or are they planned in advance? And can you expand on the evolution of your plot?
Both, really. Like the way I sit down with every book, my beginning process is the same. I always do like what I call my notes. I do it on my computer now, but I used to just do it with a legal pad and a pen. And I would sit down and just write these like kind of like ideas and questions down, you know, because I have sort of like a seed planted for a story. So I'll sit down and be like, what about this? Who would be involved in this? So it's almost like I'm talking to myself, you know, an imaginary co-writer, I guess. And so certain ideas be there from the beginning, you know, and like, I'll use Ian as an example. Like my original idea for Ian was he was going to be the one that kind of messed everything up, you know, for Marcy. And, you know, he was originally just going to be the villain. He was like going to be the typical crime fiction type character, you know, that has his own dastardly meaning, you know, and reasons for doing everything. And he was going to betray her at the end. And as I started writing it, I was like, no, that's not Ian. Ian's not that type of person, you know? And so they sort of start to evolve and flesh out in the story. So like some elements will remain, you know, from the beginning of my note sessions all the way through the end of the book. But then more times than not, it will sort of, you know, go a completely different direction as I'm writing. And usually the direction it goes in while I'm writing is definitely the direction it needed to go. So I kind of combined both ways into making a complete book.
Yeah, I don't remember all of the names he dropped, but were you a part of any of those writing retreats that Beauregard and his buddies would go on?
As of yet, no, but I was invited to the next one, so I'm trying to make that happen.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a packed one, too. There's going to be a lot of people at that one, so it'd be really cool to get together with a lot of these other writers that, you know, I'm friends with, and we just get together and write. You know, that's something that I've always enjoyed doing and hope I get to do it this time, too.
Yeah, I imagine that having all of those highly, highly talented creatives, you know, in one place would have like a synergistic effect where 4 + 4 = 12 or 12 + 12 equals, you know, 40, something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, just at a convention, like we were all together at AuthorCon just a few weeks ago, and it was like that there. And we were there at tables meeting people, selling books, signing books. We were, you know, doing panels and stuff like that. But, you know, the whole time there, it's just like this energy that's being passed from each person because you're in an entire gigantic room filled with writers and readers. And it just, I don't know, it does something to you, you know. So to be able to go and do that, but like in a much more personal level, you know, and much more private and just sort of homed in. Oh man, that just almost sounds like the dream right there, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I still have not been to any sort of a literary con. I'm going to try to make it to the Texas Author Con that Merrill David puts on. It's about a 3-hour drive from me, so hopefully I can make that in July.
Yeah, if you get the chance to, definitely, I think you would enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, probably spend way too much money.
Oh, yeah, you'll definitely leave with a lot of books.
Well, circling back to the book, the group keeps encountering horrific situations, each of which could be turned into a novel itself. The proffered reason for all this mayhem befalling them is that there are supernatural forces at work trying to prevent them from making contact with Old Scratch. What would those forces be?
It's basically the same forces of Old Scratch. It's kind of the way I look at it is almost like initiation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like the path to Old Scratch is basically paved with curses and evil. And so everything around it's been, you know, affected by that. So as Marcy and them are traveling through, they encounter many different areas that other people have encountered ahead of them. And pretty much everything that Old Scratch has done has left it, you know, as a wasteland in itself, pretty much. So the way I look at it is Old Scratch as well. If they make it through this and she makes it through that, she makes it through this, you know, it's almost like she's just proving herself like how serious she is to make that deal. So it's all connected to Old Scratch. It's, that whole path is going right on top of his roots, you know.
Yeah. So kind of reminds me of Beauregard's book, Eyes of Desperation. What Red has to do for his daughter is he's going to have to go through some shit.
Yeah, I've got that here. I have not read it yet. I've got the red and black version.
Oh, yeah. Both of them are great. I've had Aaron on. Well, I've had both of them on. Aaron's been published. I'm about to publish Volpe in like a week or two, I think. Both of them are great. And I was really shocked when I heard the black version. I was like, oh, it must be some other, you know, degenerate gambler. I didn't realize it was the Black Widow's point of view. I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome.
They're nice guys. I love Aaron and Daniel.
Yeah. Yeah. Super nice guys. Yeah. I would love to meet them in person. Obviously love to meet you in person. All of the extreme horror writers. Well, circling back to the book is written in the first person from Marcy's point of view, and she at several points breaks the fourth wall. Besides being an unreliable narrator, how did telling the story from Marcy's point of view make the story more compelling?
Well, it was kind of like what I was saying earlier. It was also a little scary because, you know, I'm a 44-year-old man writing from a young mother's point of view. And so that was very intimidating. But compelling, you know, I read a lot of crime fiction, especially the old crime fiction, you know, like Mickey Spillane, Gil Brewer, you know, those guys. And I like how when they're telling the story, it's almost like they're talking, you know, they're not like writing the story. They're saying the story in almost like dialogue. It's first person. It's kind of short, you know, punchy prose. And they go back and forth a lot. So it's like, you know, they'll be making their point, you know, telling the story of what happened, but then they'll kind of add in something that makes you remember like, oh, okay, yeah, that's right. This person went through that. So this person is telling that story to me. You know, it's not like I'm reading the story. He's telling me about it. So I wanted Marcy to sort of be like that as well. Like where basically she's writing it down, but she's also, I don't want to say she's changing her story as it goes, because she doesn't really change it too much. But yeah, I know what you mean by what she breaks the fourth wall. It's kind of like where she corrects herself sometimes. And Jim Thompson is one of my favorite writers. I don't know if you've ever read any of his stuff. He's from Texas. He was a Southern crime writer. I think you would like his stuff. And he did that a lot with books like The Killer Inside Me and stuff where you can't really trust the narrator. So it's like, was the narrator is telling you the story, but at the same time, you kind of catch the narrator telling a lie. And I really wanted Marcy to be like that, but also I wanted her to be sympathetic. So it was very, I don't want to say challenging because that was probably the easiest time I've ever had writing a book. It just poured out of me. I wrote it literally in weeks and it was so much fun. And I think one of the things that made it so much fun was that I really didn't know if I could take what Marcy was saying to heart, because it was like, she's not completely trustworthy, but at the same time, she's very trustworthy, so I don't know, it made her human, and I really like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess her being the center of the story, we get not only the story, not only her introspection, but introspection through the deep context of her emotion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And she's a very emotional person, as she should be. She's gone through a lot.
Yeah.
And she keeps going through a lot. She's been through a lot, and she keeps going through a lot.
Yeah, as I made my way through the book, I was like, God damn it, this shit just keeps getting worse. Well, kind of in line with what I just said, the horrific situations that the group keeps walking into culminate with more deviant rednecks. I feel like I can say rednecks. It's okay. But this time...
Yeah, I mean, we're surrounded by... We're in the area. So
yeah. I think I'm good. Even more deviant rednecks. But this time, one of them is a 16-year-old girl who is a homicidal maniac. And this group, or couple, I should say, also severely alters the trajectory of the story. So with all the crazy people they encountered on their way to their destination, how did you come up with the order in which they would be encountered? And how did you determine that this couple would be the ones to so dramatically change the dynamic of the story?
Yeah, what's funny, when I read that question, when you said it, I was like, yes, I was glad that you asked about them, because I had no idea that they were going to be in that story until Marcy walks into that gas station.
No shit.
And that was when they popped up. I mean, and I was writing at night, and it was right before I went to bed, and I was like, I'm going to finish this chapter, and I'm going to go to bed. And I wrote that and went to bed. And I was like, I have no idea who these people are. And that's who they ended up becoming. And it wasn't an intentional plan for them to change the story either. But I knew that they had to get to where they were going. And they had just come from a horrible situation at a hotel. I'm not going to go into the detail. So, you almost think like, well, that's got to be it. They've got to be heading to Old Scratch now. But then this happens. And I don't know. It's just, as soon as I introduced them, I questioned it a few times. I was like, maybe I shouldn't put them in there. Should I take them out? And this was before I got too deep into them. And I was like, no, it just feels natural, the way they play off of the other characters and everything. Mm-hmm. And that girl, man, she was so much fun to write. And she was so crazy. And she was straight from a crime fiction novel too. She was like, how like back in the 50s, they always had like those juvenile delinquent books, and like, this is your child if she hangs out with these type of people, that like completely sensationalize these horrible stories about the youth of the 50s and everything and what's going to happen to them. And so she was basically taken from those type of fear stories, of like, this is what your kid will become, if she listens to Elvis, stuff like that. And so I put her in there, and I had a lot of fun with her. But then, it's kind of like the same thing with Ian, it's like they get in there and dang it, it's almost like they fit, it's like they fit perfectly. Mm-hmm. So they became like a larger group in a way. And as far as like the order goes, the only thing I had, that I knew that would happen ahead of time was the first interaction with the rednecks, the ones in the pickup truck. And I sort of foresaw that one when I was doing my notes. And then the little scary part that happens at that little rest stop. And those were sort of pre-planned. And I was like, yeah, they need to get a little bit worse each time. And when I got to the hotel, it was literally originally going to be they just stay the night in the hotel. Mm. But then I started thinking, I was like, wonder what would happen. And so then I went from there, and then I introduced those other two.
Well, finally, they made it to the town of Bannon and meet yet another band of crazy rednecks, but these ones are definitely the most dangerous for a reason I will not reveal. The story seemed to imply that Bannon was a mythical town, but it was evidently real enough to have its own law enforcement and real enough that other people attempted to make pilgrimages to the town in search of Old Scratch, including some pesky YouTubers. So you kind of already answered this. It was part of a town. You can't find it on GPS, I'm assuming. So was there a particular reason that it existed?
Well, it was the original old town in the folklore that they talk about in the book. So the other towns sort of came up around it and kind of tried to hide it, from existence and pretend like it didn't exist, but that, the old cemetery is still there. What's left of the old church is still there. And people find out about it, through word of mouth and try to make their way out there.
Gotcha. Well, the ending is insane, producing very conflicting emotions, especially when you find out about the insane betrayal that has been leveled at Marcy. But not only that, you find out that Marcy's past isn't what she believes it to be. Based on the way that Old Scratch deals with Marcy at the end, were you attempting to convey that Old Scratch is compassionate or that he's just an ethical businessman? And can you expand on the nature of this entity?
I wouldn't say he's compassionate because he doesn't show her those things like, out of the kindness of his heart, to show where she's been deceived. He's more or less showing it to her. So that way she has, I guess, more fuel for her fire. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely something that he's doing that more for his own benefit because it'll benefit him more in the end, as far as what he does after he gets his deals. So he's basically, I guess, like you said, through and through, he's a businessman making sure that the deal goes through no matter what, that he seals the deal.
Gotcha. Well, it was a great book. Listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. And there was a book that you have from 2019 that I discovered too late to read before the show entitled Master of Pain. You co-wrote this book with Wrath James White. Can you tell us a little bit about this book? Because it is officially on my TBR list.
Yeah, that book was a lot of fun. And, we're talking about that writer's retreat. Wrath is going to be at that writer's retreat. So I definitely would like to go be a part of that with him and work on something else. Yeah, basically, Wrath is so much better at explaining it than I am, but I'll try and go over the details. It's loosely based on a real-life serial killer, and he was just an awful, awful human being. Not that any of them are good human beings, but he was not only a serial killer, but he was kind of like a serial killer who also steal people's lives. And in the book, we have this guy, he calls himself the Master of Pain. He's like in the message boards, and he's always looking for his own personal slaves, basically to own these women. And he ends up doing whatever he wants to with them and kills them. And there's a character who's just sort of at the end of her rope. She has nowhere to go. She's lost her job. She just is disgusted with herself. And she's kind of, into that BDSM lifestyle, and she reaches out to the Master of Pain, the slave master. That's what he goes by on the message boards. Mm-hmm. And she devotes herself to him, and she's the type of character who wants to be his slave, but then she realizes how much that is going to come with a cost.
Okay. Well, when I had Kristopher Triano on the show, we discussed the difference between splatterpunk and extreme horror. We seem to both be of the mind that splatterpunk was the super gory, super gross, super depraved content, whereas extreme horror was the intensely violent, realistic, transgressive, grief-inducing, soul-crushing content. Would you agree with that estimation? And if not, what would you say the delineation is?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I'd also go as far as to say that splatterpunk is also the term that was given to the writers of splatterpunk type stories back in the 80s. I think David J. Scow was the one that coined the term. He said we're all just splatterpunks. And what he meant is they write splatter. 80s horror movies were super gory and super crazy and very wet, and these were books that were like that too. So they were the splatterpunks,
Uh-huh. Well, how would you classify your work? Splatterpunk or extreme horror?
Oh man, it changes. It changes each time. I would probably say more splatterpunk than extreme, although Old Scratch is probably more towards the extreme. My latest one, Lucy, is probably more towards the extreme. The one I'm working on now is probably more towards the extreme, but definitely splatter because that's kind of what I grew up on. It was my bread and butter.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up in the 80s, watching, Friday the 13th and Evil Dead and all these horror movies from the video stores and late night on Cinemax, just shaped my creativity to what it is today. So I'd probably say definitely leans more towards the splatterpunk.
Gotcha. Well, your bio says that you've written over 20 novels. When did you begin publishing, and what was the impetus that took you from simply writing to writing with the firm intention to get the work published?
Wow, I can tell you exactly what that was. First became published in 2011. It didn't take me as long as it does some people, thankfully, but I had a lot of help. So I can't take any type of sole credit for any of that. I had a lot of help. But I've always liked to write, even when I was younger. I asked my parents, I was like, what are the people that do the movies? And, they were like, oh, the directors. And I was like, the people that make them say what they say. And they're like, oh, the writers? So that's how I found out what a writer was. And it was Friday the 13th was the movie that made me ask that. So ever since I was about 5 years old, I would be creating splattery stuff. And so I would write stories, and I started getting really into, the movies and everything, and independent movies. So I wrote a couple of very low budget independent movies that did get made. And
really?
Yeah, they came and went, but they did get.
Are they still available, like on YouTube or anything?
One of them is still. It's on Vudu, free with ads.
Okay.
They changed the title of it. It used to be called Rags, but the distributor changed it to Alice in Deathland. Which doesn't really. I mean, the character's name is Alice, but that's about as close to it, I guess, it could possibly get. It's still on there. That was made back in 2010, and that was the last one that I was a part of. But what made me really, really start to pursue trying to get published and write was reading when I first read Richard Lehman and Jack Ketchum. I was a late bloomer on those. It was a fellow movie guy. His name's Trent Haga. He's been working in movies forever. And we were working on something together, and he was a big reader. And when he'd be out here, I'd see him have an Edward Lee paperback in his back pocket, and he would read between takes and stuff. And I was like, who's Edward Lee? And the most extreme I had read at the time was Bentley Little, and he's still pretty extreme himself. And so I would get to talking to Trent about books and everything, and he recommended Jack Ketchum. So I was going to have surgery, and I bought Off Season, and I was like, this to keep me busy while I'm recovering from my surgery. I read it in a day. I mean, I read that in a day. And
which book was that?
Off Season.
Off Season. Okay.
Yeah. Then he, told me to read Richard Lehman, and we were at a bookstore together, and he bought me a copy of The Cellar. And he's like, I want to make sure you get this and read it. And he was like, you remind me of this guy. And I was like, okay. And that was another one. I read it in a day. I read that whole book in a day, and it just set me on the path to try and get published, because these were movies that I like and stuff that I like to write, but they were books, and when I was a kid, these were the books that had the real graphic skeleton covers that my parents wouldn't let me buy, and so when I circled back around in my early 20s and I was finally able to start buying all these things, it just completely molded me into what I am now.
Nice. Well, so one of my questions was going to be, were you always drawn to writing extreme horror, or was there a book that set you on that path? Sounds like, was it Off Season?
Yeah, that's what definitely set me to trying to write as a career. I always wrote definitely to the more extreme, gory, splattery side of things. Even if it was a comedy, it would still be super violent, super ridiculously gory. it just comes naturally to me. So yeah, pretty much that's what I've always wanted to do. But off season showed me that, hey, you could actually write this in a book and it could possibly be published.
Mm. Well, is there anything you avoid because you feel it stifles your creativity?
As far as like in a story, or?
Yeah, more like outside yourself. Like, do you avoid alcohol? Do you avoid watching television? I guess within a story too, because I asked this question to somebody one time and I never thought about it. She said that she avoids reading books on writing craft, like something akin to On Writing by Stephen King. She's like, it just messes me up.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, because I'm the complete opposite when it comes to that. But I do know people that don't like to be told how they should do something that they already approach a certain way,
Yeah.
I think everybody who writes has their own unique approach to everything. I don't think I write any way similar to anyone else, although we have things in common. We all have our different approaches to it and everything. So, I can get what she's saying.
Yeah. Well, the idea that brought that question to my mind was I always heard there was advice given by Hemingway, write drunk, edit sober. But I actually looked it up and found numerous articles stating that he never said that and that it didn't even make sense because he wrote in the morning and didn't start drinking until the afternoon. So I was wondering, do you have any insight into the phrase itself and whether or not it has any, and I'm going to use a big word, verisimilitude?
What's funny is I always tell people, and I heard this, I think it was Robert Bloch, but I might be wrong. Don't quote me on this. And I've always gone by this, which is kind of the same concept, almost identical to what you were just saying. It's have fun first, be constructive later. So it's like, sit down, don't worry about what it sounds like as it comes out, because you can always go back and be critical of the writing when it's done. Mm-hmm. So it's like, to me, you have to have fun writing this. You have to have fun writing in general. And even if you put a book out and it doesn't sell any copies, you still have to feel good about it because you're like, man, I wrote that whole book. So it's like, I always tell people, have fun. When it's done, then you can be critical. Then you can go back and you can dissect paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence. I guess that's sort of like, writing drunk without a care in the world, but then editing sober when you're paying attention to everything, So I guess I kind of follow that same mold a little bit.
Yeah. Well, so apparently, I don't know if I was hallucinating or what was wrong with me, but I stumbled into Aaron Beauregard's live stream when he was interviewing you, and I could have sworn I heard you talking, if not about a live stream, about some sort of interactive thing you did with your readers where you wrote from prompts they provided. I mean, I guess.
Oh no, I've never done that.
Man, I must be getting old because I would almost swear on my life that's what I heard, but apparently I'm losing my goddamn mind, so I'll just move on.
It's something that's, I know of authors who have done that. The late Jay Wilburn would do that. And
were you by any chance talking about them?
We might have been,
because I'm really worried about my mental health right now.
Yeah, when I saw that question, I went, "Did we talk about that?" But yeah, he would do it, and he loved it. And me, I don't know. I almost feel like how like as a kid you go and stand at the urinal, somebody's standing behind you waiting their turn, and it's like you can't go. I worry that I would have that sort of stage fright, if I was to do something like that. They'll be like, "Okay, write something about a demon." And I'm just like, I don't know. What's a demon? So.
Yeah. It's funny. That analogy that you said is much more accurate. The one that I initially came up with is it's like letting somebody watch you bathe. Like, but no, your analogy is much more accurate, I think. Well, kudos to whoever that was that does that.
Yeah, I admire anyone who can do that. That's incredible.
Well, It seems like when I look at literature written by a younger generation, it seems to be going the way of novellas and short stories. Do you foresee fiction evolving into the shorter forms?
Some of it, yeah. I think there's a place for it, definitely. I think it also is very encouraging to people when they pick up a book and they read a whole book, so they're like, wow, I read that whole book. I think I'm going to read another book, and it definitely helps with novellas. And novellas are usually like really good lengths for horror stories because a really good horror movie's 90 minutes that has beginning, middle, and end. And a novella to me is almost like a horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't see like longer works going away. I do see the shorter works kind of maybe coming further to the front.
Mm-hmm.
And they definitely, like I said, they definitely have their place. And there's nothing like reading a great novella, something that's just short, sweet, packs a punch, and leaves you wanting to read something else.
Yeah, when I interviewed Garrett Godsey, he said something real interesting that even if someone is more predisposed to liking shorter fiction, like novellas or short stories, that same person will binge watch an entire season of a TV series. So he's like, man, It's all about pacing because he hesitates to classify it, but he says for simplicity's sake, just call it dark fantasy. And fantasy, like, I don't think there's any way fantasy can ever be shortened. I mean, by design, it's epic. It's long,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Epic. That's a perfect terminology for it.
Yeah. I don't think there was any lack of young people that were going to see the newest. What's the name of that movie? It's like 3 hours long, takes years to make. I'm having that same blank you were talking about at the urinal right now.
Oh, Avatar?
Yeah, Avatar.
Yeah. Yeah, people love that.
Yeah, I'm sure people still sit for, it's like a 3-hour movie, isn't it?
Yeah. My son, who doesn't like movies to be longer than an hour and a half, went to go see it in the theater.
Yeah.
So
Did you see Dune? The newest one?
No, not yet.
I don't know about the one that was directed by David Lynch. I always heard it was horrible, but, I don't know if those were reliable sources. But Denis Villeneuve is a mastermind, and that was so visually stunning. It was incredible.
Yeah, that's what I keep hearing. Yeah, I'm excited to see it.
Yeah. Well, are there any new authors that have come out recently that you've been impressed with?
Gosh, yeah, there's so many. I'm going to forget names. Let's see. Josh Davis, he's really good. Jonathan Tripp. Of course, Judith Sonnet. She's got a huge following already. A lot of the newer splatterpunk people, all of them have been doing really good stuff. Every time I seem to read something from a new person, it's not disappointing. Lucas Mangum, he's not exactly like brand new, but his stuff's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Aaron and Daniel, but everybody already reads them. Then there's some of the people I kind of came up with that quit writing for a while, but now they're kind of coming back into it, like David Bernstein. He's just re-released his Episodes of Violence, which if you want to read an extreme horror novel that eats at you, Episodes of Violence by David Bernstein.
Eats at you like just destroys your soul. Like,
yeah,
2 weeks after, you're like, oh God, I can't recover from this.
It's one of those where you're like, gosh, when are they going to stop?
Yeah. Please, for the love of God. Oh.
It's a great book, though.
Well, you mentioned your experience at AuthorCon. I saw a picture of you and your daughter, who I understand is your tour manager and possibly security, on social media. So I was curious to know, do your friends and family read your work? And if so, who is your biggest fan?
She's my biggest fan.
All right.
But yeah, a couple of my friends read my stuff and they're big fans. I'll give a shout out to Melinda. I've known her since school and she reads my stuff. And a few other people. What's funny is my youngest son's, I don't want to say her name for risk of the school hearing, but my youngest son's teachers read my stuff, which is kind of
nice.
And my youngest son was actually, he goes to school and goes, my dad's an author. And they're like, really? And so they'll look into it. And next thing I know, they're reading it, so I guess they like it. But a lot of family members, no.
Not so much.
When my first book came out, they were super excited. They all bought that first book, and then, it was filled with violence and stuff like that. And we're like, oh, yeah, we don't like that stuff. So.
And it's funny because I can imagine not being accustomed to splatterpunk or extreme horror. You think, like, somebody tells you, now this is some dark stuff. You're like, oh, like Friday the 13th. Yeah, okay, I can. You're like, no. You do not understand.
Yeah, my first book, I was trying to, really incorporate Clive Barker style stuff,
Mm-hmm.
So I was really going to the dark side and the extreme sadistic side.
Yeah.
And my grandmother read it and she was like, the writing was good, but it was just dirty.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I wish literary agents were like that. They could be objective, like amazing writing, but they're all thinking in terms of marketability. So it's like, I can't sell this shit,
Yeah. This isn't the end anymore.
Well, what is the life of Kristopher Rufty like outside of writing?
Just being a dad, pretty much. I'm a single dad, so I do a lot of kids activities, especially with my younger one. I've got a child about to start college and one that's starting his life living on his own, so it's different aspects. All three kids are at different aspects of their lives, so I'm pretty busy with that and do a lot of gardening, and it's the season for gardening now, so I'm excited about that. And yeah, just read, watch movies, and spend time with the kids, and do school activities, and so that's pretty much it.
All right. Sounds good. Well, Kristopher, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. So as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
My website, KristopherRufty.com, it has a link to my store where I sell signed paperbacks and stuff like that there. Usually when I have a new book come out, I'll do a early pre-order on the store before it goes live anywhere. So that way I can do signed copies first. And later this year, my novelization for the movie Redneck Zombies should be released. So I'm very excited about that. Co-wrote it with one of the screenwriters, so that's super exciting. And got a couple other book surprises coming out along the rest of the year as well. So you can look for that.
Well, now I'm excited because the word redneck is in the title. All right. Well, that all sounds good. We look forward to it. Listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Kristopher, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone that tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to follow my radio channel by clicking the link in the description so that you can listen live. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday when I will be joined by a writer of femdom and Southern Gothic that has blended the two genres into razor-sharp short stories. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.
I'm falling asleep to all the peace that you keep. Still trying to waste some time. Yeah, trying to lose your mind. Trying to lose your mind. trying to